Good morning. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Andreas Dimmelmeir. I am joining you from Brussels as the FEPS policy analyst for climate and environmental policy. And I'm very honored and pleased to be able to moderate this exciting panel on the climate emergency. Today, we have with us four distinguished speakers. First, there is Olivia Blake, who will also join us online, MP from Sheffield, and Shadow Minister for Climate Change. Yes, in the parliament. Then we have a second speaker in the order, I think in the room. We have Sakina Sheikh, a member of the London Assembly and local council member of Lewisham. Then we have Laura Cunliffe-Hall, also in the room, from chair of the Young Fabians, and then also remote as the last speaker who will arrive in a couple of minutes. We have Kerry McCarthy, Member of Parliament from Bristol East, also been working as a shadow minister on environmental issues. So just in terms of framing the discussion, I mean, I think you have a lot of very interesting things to say. The questions we are looking a little bit in your interventions would be, okay, where do we stand in terms of dealing with the climate crisis? What are the outcomes of the recent Conference of Parties 26 in Glasgow, and what, both in a European and UK perspective or worldwide perspective as well, are how can we raise the ambition, but also in terms of how can we make this a understood, supported and just transition that, politically speaking, will lead to progressive outcomes. In terms of the, say, the organizational housekeeping things, each intervention will be 5 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have something like 20-25 minutes of Q&As. If you join us online, I will read out the Q&As for you. Please post them into the little chat. And if you're in person in the room, then you will be asked by people there to pose your questions. Okay, then without further ado, I would hand over to you, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and it's a real pleasure to be involved in today's event. And apologies I can't be there in person, but it's great that we've been able to join you hybrid today. As Andreas says, I'm currently the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, but before taking up this role, I should also mention that I was the Shadow Minister for Nature, which I've obviously moved on from now. But the reason I mention that is I think it's really, really important that whenever we talk about the climate crisis, we also must talk about the crisis facing our ecological world as well. We are living through an ecological emergency and a climate emergency, and we need to take a broad view of how we can tackle the environmental breakdown at home and abroad. I'm sure everyone here knows the scale of the emergencies that we're facing, but I'll reiterate again, because at every moment, Labour has been sounding the alarm about the crisis we face. The UN called the most recent IPCC report a code red for humanity, that we need immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gases is if we are to avoid catastrophe. Now, that's pretty bleak. And I think, as the title of today's session says, this is all about how we rise to that very real and very consequential challenge. In answer to the first question about the climate summit in Glasgow, and whether it was a success or a failure, well, I think that many people came away from that feeling very disappointed about where we got to. But, you know, I think that there's still opportunities to push for more over the next year, and we will certainly be doing that and trying to hold the presidency to account over the next year. So the other side of what we're here to discuss really is around how the left should rise to the challenges that we face. And to me, it's important to keep in mind that we are facing catastrophe, because it reinforces that our response should be and must be about transformation, not business as usual. The Labour Party have pledged to spend 28 billion a year on green capital investments, from hydrogen, offshore wind, cycle paths, tree planting, flood defences, and so many more. This is a huge commitment which would really, really help us on our journey to get to net zero, but also to help in the transition that we need to see. We have also committed £6 billion a year for 10 years on nationwide housing retrofit to cut energy usage, save people on fuel bills, and end fuel poverty, which is a huge issue here in the UK, especially with the rising gas prices, which have impacted on the UK particularly badly. The climate and ecological emergency won't tolerate timidity. The Tories have failed time and time again to tackle the climate emergency. They failed to deliver on their policies. They have failed to deliver on their targets, and they failed to tackle the crisis with the urgency it demands. They were given a golden opportunity in COP26, being hosted in the UK, to be the world leaders for climate justice. And what did we see instead? More meaningless slogans, more broken promises. The climate emergency requires more than Tory inaction. We are going to respond to the crisis with renewal. And what that means is a renewal for our natural environment, of course, but it means renewing our economy, decarbonisation, and building a post-carbon future. And we can and must do this through Green New Deal principles in mind, so that climate action must have social and economic justice at its heart. Keir mentioned this in his speech at conference, and I think that people were really pleased to hear Labour saying this. And we will continue to say this, because we must look not only to look at our natural environment and how we rewild it and make it more accessible to people in nature, but also to look at the industries and learn the lessons of past deindustrialisation, to make sure that we're not just leaving vast swathes of the country without access to good quality jobs. A just transition is about making sure that we have good, green, unionised jobs in low carbon industries, that we prioritise this as at the core of our offer, so that no worker suffers as a consequence of climate action. That's why we have a Just Transition working group for workers, trade unions, industry leaders and communities to set out how we should decarbonise our economy. I'm chairing my first one of those next week, and I'm really looking forward to it. And we're going to embed Labour's Green New Deal in every aspect of the next manifesto. It's absolutely key that we work across shadow departmental teams to make sure that we're unlocking the full potential as we go into the next election, to make sure that we are able to keep our promises, to deliver the policies that need to be done, and to make sure that we are doing everything that we can and absolutely rising to that challenge. So with the scale of the huge nature and climate emergency, it can feel a little bit hopeless at times, but I hope that where the Tories are failing to address it, we can be the ones to talk about social inequality, economic justice, and our international responsibilities. These have to be at the core of the crisis and how we respond to it, and they must be central to everything we do in our response. To me, rising to the challenge of the climate crisis must mean a Green New Deal with a just transition at its heart, rapidly reducing emissions through measures that redress social, economic and global inequality. So anything but this is to fail to meet the challenge at the scale that is needed. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much just for keeping in the time. And then now I would hand over to the room where people are in person, to first to Sakina and then to Laura. And then I see that Kerry also joins us online, so I'll have you as last speaker then. So please, if we can switch.
Hello, good afternoon and Happy New Year, everyone. As you heard from the chair, my name is Sakina Sheikh. I'm a London-wide Assembly member. I'm also a councillor in Lewisham. And yeah, a real pleasure to be here joining the Fabians in the new year to think about how we essentially gear up for a Labour government, in my opinion. I think that's what we're doing here. We're sharpening our tools, we're dusting off the cobwebs from Christmas, and we're getting ourselves sort of geared up to say, we set the agenda for the future. Our politics, our ideas are the ones that will inspire people. So let's get together, let's bump heads, and let's bring them to life. And I think really big congratulations to the Fabians, especially on the kind of hybrid format. I think it's, something that I was discussing with some of the organisers, and a big shout out and thank you to a lot of the people who do the work behind the scenes to bring something like this to life. A hybrid system means, I think it really transforms our capacity for our movement to be accessible. And I think it's something that's long overdue. So it's really fantastic to see it kind of come to life today. So I'm attempting to do a balancing act on my legs with a stopwatch because I can talk forever if I'm not timing myself. So I will contain myself to 5 minutes if I can, but apologies if I go over for a couple of minutes. So before joining the London Assembly in May, I sort of spent 6 years doing climate campaigning. It was a real pleasure. I got a chance to meet some really inspiring people, a lot of whom are in the UK and many of whom are outside of the UK. And I think for me, what it's meant is when I was doing my climate campaigning and now when I bring it to life in the Assembly on the Environment Committee, but also I do planning and regeneration. That's my political lead on the London Assembly, and thinking about how the future of our housing systems and the infrastructure of our cities should be defined by kind of a climate lens. As we begin to reshape the future and reconfigure the very infrastructure of our city, it's absolutely necessary, and the compelling kind of linchpin of that is the climate movement, is the climate transition, because in order for us to actually meet 1.5, in order for us to actually make sure that those who are most affected by climate change and often the least responsible do actually sort of are at the heart of our solutions and at the heart of kind of the transformation that's required. I think kind of teasing in together the kind of planning, climate, housing has been really exciting and something I've really enjoyed synthesizing in the last sort of few years. And the kind of key question for me that keeps coming out and again, and Olivia's already touched on this, which is who defines the transition? Who defines the climate transition? And I think for me, in answering that question, it's always really important to put climate change in its wider context, in the context of how we got here in the first place. And I think it's really important for those of us on the left who believe in equality and equity, that in order for our solutions to be equitable in terms of who they affect, we have to understand the origins of where the problem came from. And for me, that's countries like the UK and other countries in the global north. We had our industrial revolutions, and that was fantastic in terms of our development, but what it means is that did disproportionately contribute our CO2 emissions into the world. And actually what we see is when we had our industrial revolution, when we catalyzed, alongside many other countries, climate change, it's actually not us on the front lines. We've seen flooding that's been extremely devastating this year and even last year. We've seen fires in Australia and even in Canada. And I think that kind of frontline feeling of climate change is horrendous, and it's kind of finally at our front doors. But I think it's important to say that this has been at the front doors of many countries for many years. Bangladesh has a third underwater, one of the least responsible countries for climate change in terms of its development and its CO2 emissions, but probably the country most on the front line. If we look at Kenya and we look at farmers and the displacement they've had because of the dysfunction of the climate and no longer being able to live, no longer being able to work. And if we look at Indigenous women in the US, whether that's in Canada or America, often again on the front lines of the battle of the fossil fuel industries. If we look at Dakota Access Pipeline as the probably most recent and mainstream example of that. So I think that wider context is always essential. Oh God, I've got to speed up. And I think for me that really came to life, not in this COP actually, but in COP21 in Paris, when I was there and I met loads of incredible indigenous communities and loads of incredible activists, mostly from the States. And it was them who stood in the negotiations and said it's 1.5 to stay alive. And it is that kind of ferocity that has allowed 1.5 to be the marker that we attempt to achieve. And we shouldn't be attempting to achieve it. We should be unequivocal of those on us on the left who says we might not need 1.5 here in the UK, but there are many people globally, small state islands, that will just totally disappear if we don't meet that aspiration. So who defines it? I'd say people in the global south, but also here in the UK, trade unionists. If we're talking about huge reindustrialization, if we're talking about phasing out industries and bringing in new industries, we have to ask working people who are in those industries, what do they want with their future? How do we ensure that the future of people working in aviation or in manufacturing around cars, what does it look like to be reskilled on their terms, with secure long-term unionised jobs? And also, let's go even further. Let's talk about working class communities, black and brown communities. It is a racialised issue. Like environmental racism is a term that came from the States because, again, it is the poorest and people from BAME communities who are most affected by poor air quality, and the ones, again, often least responsible. If you look at Newham and you look at the levels of air quality there, and they have the lowest level of car ownership, but some of the highest levels of air quality. Even where I'm a councillor in Lewisham, Ella Kesey Deborah, a really wonderful young girl who died, and I know her mother, who's an incredible Rossi, ferocious campaigner, and she campaigned and campaigned to make sure it was realised that it was air quality, and it's on her death certificate, and she's the only one, the first in the UK, I think in the world actually, to have it recognised that it was poor air quality that resulted in her death. And that is a form of environmental racism, because it's the people, again, least responsible, bearing the costs of the actions of others. And fortunately, I get to work in City Hall with a mayor who gets it. Sadiq gets that actually climate change isn't just a kind of abstract issue, it's an issue of social justice. It's an issue of making sure that actually everyone has a right to air quality. And that's why things like ULEZ, although not, it's a little bit like Marmite, I think it's okay to say that, having done any of us who've spent many a time on dialogue and speaking to especially people in outer London, it is a bit like Marmite, but it is also essential that we skill ourselves up with saying, this is about equity, this is about equality, this is about protecting the poorest, and actually ULEZ has resulted in bettering air quality in London, and actually I think we should be really proud of that, and we should, you know, we should say that with our chest. And I think, like I said, Sadiq gets that this is a social justice issue, and we on the left need to be defining that. So I'm going to try and wrap up and cut off half of my speech, because I obviously didn't time it very well when I was writing it, but hopefully it'll come out in the questioning. Just to sort of say, the ideas for the future are there, so let's get onto the streets, let's get onto the doors and make them happen. We've got the local elections in I was going to say 2018, this May, 2020, the years have been flying by, this May. And what I think we can do, especially when we're cultivating our Labour vote, is people, when we talk about retrofitting, energy bills are going through the roof right now, right? And people, I think the thing that's been hard for us to do as a Labour movement is make climate change a relatable issue to maybe people who are like, listen, mate, I'm just trying to pay the bills, like get dinner on the table, look after my 3 kids. And it's like, actually, if we're talking about energy bills, if we're talking about retrofitting, this is a really key agenda that Labour is pushing, that Sadiq is pushing, that Keir is pushing, and it can help us politicise people in a way of saying fuel poverty, poor housing quality is an inherited Tory agenda, and actually let's put getting your house retrofitted in the wider context of the climate emergency and the climate future, and then you get people invested in the changes that are incoming that we have to have in order to meet 1.5. So yeah, really excited to be here, really excited to be having these conversations, and look forward to the Q&A to get further into it. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks a lot. Also for pointing out, I just pass on to Lauren right now. Since you're
Thanks very much, Andreas. Thank you. And fantastic to hear from Sakina and so many incredible panelists today. A huge thank you to FEPS and the Fabian Society for facilitating this discussion. I'm Laura Cunliffe-Hall. I'm the chair of the Young Fabians, a youth branch of the Fabian Society and the UK's only think tank run by and for young people. I'm also the social and digital media lead for Labour and Communications, a network for comms and public affairs professionals. Previously, I've served as the communications officer for our Young Fabians Environment Network, where I co-authored a pamphlet on accountability for the climate crisis ahead of COP26, which Kerry spoke at as well, and is very pertinent for the discussion that we're having today. We're here to talk about rising to the challenge of the climate emergency. In the past, this was often framed as an issue for future generations, but the climate crisis is happening to all of us now. The impacts have been felt in the global south for years, yet in the global north, in cities like London, where we are now, air pollution is at record levels, and we are in a very real crisis, as evident on Friday, when Londoners were told to reduce levels of physical exertion due to banned 10 pollution levels. The last time pollution levels hit this mark was back in March 2018. The 50 most polluted areas in the UK also show the highest rates of child poverty. The climate crisis therefore exacerbates existing inequalities and public health crisis. Business as usual, as Olivia said, isn't cutting it, and we on the left need to take action. 2021 was termed by the UN as a make or break year for climate action, with a postponed COP26 summit taking place. There was lots of optimism during the summit in Glasgow from attendees, but since then, with such an oversaturated news agenda, I don't believe that the cut through that we all talk about a lot was genuinely achieved with the wider public, and that's with COP being hosted on our doorstep. I think many expected to see financeable and actionable climate justice. Instead, corporations continue to participate in greenwashing, leaving members of the public frustrated at the slow progress and continued focus on individuals rather than the action of collective or national governments. However, With Germany chairing the G7 group of countries with strong green credentials, and other European neighbours like Norway with hydro energy and Denmark's wind power offering hope for the future, closer international cooperation is essential to how we can successfully rise to the challenge of a climate emergency. We need to transition at home in the company of our European neighbours, whilst actively also facilitating transitions across the globe, particularly in countries that are climate vulnerable, to strengthen climate resilience and enact climate justice. At the current moment, there is a real appetite for change amongst the public. For example, COP Consultancy's November 2021 Attitudes to Net Zero research identified high levels of public support for the UK's net zero target, and found 53% of people do not believe that the government strategy is doing enough to reach net zero by 2050, let alone any earlier. Labour can promote the fantastic work that's being carried out by Labour councils at a local level in cities like London, Liverpool and Oxford to help reach net zero, mobilising plans for zero emissions fleet of hydrogen buses and citywide air pollution targets. By leveraging the success of the activity already happening on the ground, Labour can win over the public by proving that our party is willing to take action that can be implemented even more effectively when we're in power. Recently, I've written for Labour in Communications about how we on the left must increase the urgency with which we communicate around the climate crisis. We must use clear, targeted messaging to have constructive conversations with voters about climate. Jobs must be at the centre of this narrative. Applying lessons learned from mistakes of deindustrialisation across the 80s, Labour can make clear to voters the party is willing to do things differently to address the dual challenges of a pandemic and the climate crisis through a credible, jobs-rich green recovery. But we need to speak their language of communities. Research for the Fabian Society and FEPS' Talking Green project focuses on how some of the language we use to talk about climate-related and environmental issues, terms like Green Industrial Revolution and Green New Deal, isn't necessarily resonating with key voter groups other than those already convinced. We could be more specific, for example, about the type of jobs a green transition will create and their quality to engage the public. Moving forwards, we need a more positive, future-focused narrative around climate. Britain Talks Climate segmentation research indicates that although the public is fractured and divided in many ways, climate change is emerging as an issue that has the potential to unite us. Labour can connect our left-behind communities in a way that the Tories, for all their talk of levelling up, have proved again and again that they cannot and will not, and show the public, as Joe Cox so famously said, that we really do have far more in common than that which divides us. The next issue of the Young Fabians' upcoming magazine Antics, which is currently being mind-mapped by our fantastic Antics editor Amber Khan, will focus on the environment, reaching vital climate goals and amplifying the voices of young people who have been such strong political actors in the climate crisis in forcing older generations to pay attention, which feeds into our Young Fabians theme of the year of what does a Labour Britain look like for young people? The answer to this has to be fairer, greener and internationalist if we are to truly rise to the challenge of a climate emergency. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Now I hope you can hear us, Kerry, and we go back to the online intervention.
Thank you, everybody, and sorry that I missed the first couple of minutes. Had a real technological nightmare trying to get online. But what's good about going last is I think people have covered a lot of the general points. So I'm going to talk about a couple of specific things that I've been working on and that I think would help engage the public. But just as a starting point, the question was COP26 climate summit a success or failure? And I actually think it was incredibly disappointing in that they sort of pulled a few, managed to salvage a few little things at the end. So it wasn't sort of a complete and utter waste of time, but I think we could have made so much more about it. And obviously now it's about whether what was agreed on paper is actually delivered. And one of the things that I said that I wanted to talk about quite specifically was we've already talked about with some of the previous speakers have sort of mentioned the most climate vulnerable countries, and I've set up an all-party group on small island developing states, and half the battle is getting people to recognise the threat to countries such as the Maldives, which will literally disappear underwater if we don't address rising sea levels and the extreme weather events associated with climate change are a real threat to lots of small islands as well. But it's one thing getting pledges on paper that money for adaptation will be made available to them. It's actually getting that money to them, and I know a lot of them have real problems. Just if you think it's, there will be countries with population the size of my constituency having to negotiate all the bureaucracy and actually get their hands on funding can be really difficult. And there's some quite exciting things happening with blue finance, where it's a way of offsetting. So companies that are emitting would be able to invest in blue bonds issued by small island states so that they can preserve their marine environment in particular. They can prevent overfishing, but they can also then pay for some of that adaptation that is needed. And I think that's quite, there's a few organisations involved in pressing for that, and they've got MPs lined up as blue carbon champions. I think land use is still an issue that it's just about now on the climate change agenda. You have a lot more people that are aware of the environmental impact of our food and farming system. You've seen veganuary, huge numbers of people signing up to that. That wasn't the case even a few years ago, but there's still quite a lot of resistance to that. So I would like to see much more. It's partly about land use as natural carbon solutions, so protecting our peatlands, planting mangroves, planting trees, preventing deforestation, and those links between what we consume in this country and deforestation overseas. The fact that the Amazon is now a net carbon emitter rather than a carbon sink is actually devastating. It's really quite shocking that we've reached that state, and that's something by consumer behaviour we can help address that. But we can also put pressure on businesses, particularly the supermarkets, to not source products that are linked to deforestation of the Amazon, whether that be, actually beef, for example, that is imported from there, but particularly things like palm oil and livestock feed. But that does need more government intervention. And at the moment, the government is committed to stamping out illegal deforestation in our supply chain. We know that Bolsonaro in Brazil, to name just one, is now making legal things that would previously be illegal. We've just signed a trade deal with Australia, which again, their beef exports are linked to deforestation. And I think that's when we're sort of asked how you can talk about these things in a way that engages people. I think something that is directly linked to people's behaviour and something that they can influence by their own actions, but they can also call on the government to act as well, which the food and farming system is very much, fits into that category. I think that's important. The final thing I say, I was until I stood down towards the end of last year, the Shadow Minister for Green Transport. It's still progress on the decarbonisation of transport is incredibly slow. The government's supposed action plan that was released last year amounts to little more than words. As an electric car owner myself, who can't charge at home, the lack of charging points, the lack of affordability. It's one thing saying to people they've got to make the switch from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric. It's unaffordable for an awful lot of people. And when you talk about some of the sort of heating systems, the heat pumps and that, the same applies. So it absolutely has to be a just transition. We need to promote it to people on the basis there's lots of green jobs involved in this, whether it's car manufacturing or battery production, or whether it's involved in things like there's a lot of good research being done on green aviation fuels. We need and also the heat pump installation. So we need to present it that it's partly about the job side as well, and the green recovery that Ed Miliband's working on. But in terms of people's own, we can't just sort of be preaching to people about changing their lifestyles without making sure that it's something that is affordable. And at the moment, we're just not seeing government action on that front.
All right. So thanks a lot for all the fascinating interventions. We've made a lot of very good points and pertinent points. I think in terms of going about the next 20 minutes that we still have, I'd first start with the questions that we have in the Q&A and then go over to the in-room questions. Just the way of summary, perhaps for people, if you still want to think about your questions. I mean, I think we heard a lot of very good points about also, I mean, the environmental systems and the really emergency where we are both in terms of climate and in terms of environment and land use, and to what it, and I think there was pretty much an agreement among the panelists that what is happening right now at the level of the COP, both the COP that's upcoming in Cumming on biodiversity, as well as the one that we've seen in Glasgow, there is still much more to do. But the other thing that also was pointed out, which is from a progressive perspective, a very important thing that gets overlooked if we only focus on the big diplomatic stuff oftentimes, or it's championed by people and states that are not as powerful, even though they're much more affected, is this question of who defines the transition and the very unequal both contribution to the problems that we're facing and the impact that people then are having from this, both within countries and internationally speaking, in terms of climate justice. So then we've heard a lot about the investment needs that have to be there to make this a fair and just transition, the employment effects that have to be governed. Also, thanks a lot, Laura, for mentioning our FEPS-Fabians joint Talking Green study, where we basically, from a polling perspective, saw, okay, green jobs is fine, green industrial revolution, but it needs to be very concrete. Otherwise, we don't really get the trust of people in this very abstract slogan. So I think those are a couple of things, all very, very great interventions that we've heard here, and I don't want to take too much space here, but just for the for people in the room and the audience to ask questions. So I think I have one question already in the Q&A, so I encourage you, if you're joining us online, to submit further questions, but I'm just going to read this now, and then we would go to the questions in the room. Also, if panelists, if you want to react to each other, please also do that. So the questions I have here is basically on nuclear energy, where the Q&A from the online participant asked, okay, why does Labour promote this? Because it is not a clean or renewable power source, so to speak. So, and that there's kind of an electoral concern that the Green Party, well, positions itself very strongly against it, whereas Labour does not. Do you have anybody who wants to take this question about the role of nuclear energy?
I mean, I'm happy to, and I think if that's okay, Andreas.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question, and I think that, you know, clearly nuclear is part of the energy mix right across Europe. Actually, it's not just an issue for the UK, and you know, we've seen different countries taking different approaches to this. And you know, we did support the government on their nuclear financing, well, we didn't oppose it this week because it was about the single project, but we've been quite clear that before every project we need to revisit this and make sure that this is still the right thing to be doing. I think that, you know, it's obviously part of our energy mix at the moment, and you know, there are concerns around jobs in the industry, but you know, in the future it probably will come to a point where we don't have as much nuclear, or we see the phasing out. But I don't think we're there yet because the government is still pursuing projects, and unfortunately we have such insecurity in our energy at the moment that, you know, whilst I would like to see the government prioritising a lot more renewables, and you know, we've seen them really hit hard solar, on land wind farms and other forms of energy, and not really putting the investment in that they need to on other alternatives like heat pumps. It's clear that at the moment that project that's happening at the moment is being supported by the party and will be, if that's okay.
All right, thanks a lot. So I don't see any other questions. So if there's any reactions to the role of
Sorry, Andreas, I think Sakina's just going to come in on that question as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just thought I'd add, I just wanted to kind of uplift what you were saying, Olivia, which I totally agree with you, that I think as we go into the future, nuclear needs to become more and more redundant. And I guess what I wanted to also say is, I think part of the problem with nuclear and saying that we need to transition out of it, and allowing, I guess, the government to kind of delay that transition, as it were, by starting new projects, or kind of additional financing of it, is we lose focus, I think, of the infrastructure of the future that we could be building instead. And I think that, for instance, offshore wind is something that I think in the UK we should take much more advantage of. I think, if I understand correctly, have the capacity to technically power like the whole of Northern Europe with our offshore wind. but we don't really own much of the infrastructure. In fact, I think over 50% of our offshore wind infrastructure is either owned by European companies or by European states. And I find that wild. I think like if we had even, you know, sort of local councils, I mean, I think you'd start with sort of like state infrastructure building of offshore wind as a really long-term compatible way of not just energizing the UK, but also like as a way of kind of being able to place yourself in a slightly, how can I put this, redistributive and powerful position in Europe as well, by saying that we actually have the infrastructure and we have the resources to kind of pedal the climate future. But also I think you could have some exciting ideas about how local government also begins to transition into infrastructural ownership of climate. If you look at local government pension funds, one of the campaigns that I worked on a lot was fossil fuel divestment. And I think Sadiq has done a huge amount on divesting the pension fund of City Hall, but also local councils, like especially in London, have really been spearheading that fossil fuel divestment. And we're seeing a huge shift in capital away from previous investments into fossil fuel companies. And although that can't, as finance work, go directly into funding new infrastructural projects, it does also begin to open up the conversation locally of where do we want our public money spent. There have been some really exciting examples in Scotland, I think it's Falkirk, where they've actually funded social housing from their local government pension fund because it's long-term, sustainable, slow return money. So it meets the fiduciary duty of the pension committee, but it also means that people are seeing their public money being spent locally in infrastructure that's bettering their quality. So yeah, I think what nuclear could do is we could be kind of imaginative and creative of saying, let's quickly kind of pivot this and say, well, actually, what would we actually want if we could define it and move us towards that space? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then I think I'll put it to you in the room who I see already some hands, so that you can ask some other questions if there would be.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andreas. There's lots of hands. I think we'll go first to the gentleman at the front.
Hi, Ajay Alawalia, Streatham CLP and Executive Committee member of CIRA. So if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to give a quick shout out for CIRA if people aren't aware of it. It's the sort of environmental and energy group within the Labour Party. So if you are interested in these topics, check it out and become a member if you want. I have worked in the renewable energy industry for over a decade, and I'm a sort of climate change activist as well. And my reflections on COP, having cycled up there as well, was that it's a question of leadership. I mean, we can talk about leadership in all many aspects, but you know, how could we speak with any sort of position when we hadn't hadn't stopped this prospective coal mine that's happening up in Cumbria, or there was this question mark over Camber? You know, we have no moral authority to tell other countries to do all these different things. If, you know, acknowledging the points around historical carbon emissions as well, if we're not even prepared to say no to some of these things which are currently happening. Just one last reflection, if you'll allow me. I could talk to you about offshore wind and all the rest of it, because that's my area of expertise and the energy mix. But one of the things that I've sought to do is work with local organisations in South London, so things like Lambeth Community Solar or my local Friends of the Earth group. And one of the big things there is to take part and participate and support local campaigns such as air quality, which is really great to hear about this morning. Community energy is super important. So I do believe in decentralized energy, but obviously centralized energy is really important as well. But how can you engage in these community schemes to improve your local area and your communities as well? And I think that's where, particularly for me, that just transition aspect is really important, because the more people we can convince and get on side, the more people we can sort of take along with us. Whether it is those overpriced sustainability shops where you get your soap and everything from, or whether it be, you know, sort of people being able to invest a tenner or 50 quid in your local community solar project or something like that. Educating and bringing people along with us is key as part of that just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, thank you. And would anybody like to just respond to those comments? I think all the points you made were particularly pertinent, and I think particularly about how we can get people engaged and particularly representing their communities. And I think we really need to, again, in the narrative about climate, highlight how this can actually create more sustainable and prosperous communities, and it is future facing, and that should be integrated into urban planning and how we visualize our towns and cities and our spaces going forward as well. But I'll just open it up to anybody else on the panel who'd want to come in on that.
I think I would just say that, I agree, with all his comments, and we've had these discussions in the past, in CERA. But I think Bristol had its own energy company. I'm a Bristol MP, and that did run into problems. So it's not easy, but I think it's so important to sort of talk to people and to have at the forefront this idea, when we talk about future ownership of energy, that idea of the sort of monolith, centralized nationalisation model of the 70s, that's not where we're at. It should be about community ownership. And there's some really exciting things happening about energy from waste. So if you can actually say to people, the waste that is collected in Bristol, and we've got huge waste plants out in Darren Jones' constituency, that could power the city. And I think that's a great way of getting people inspired, and it also sort of helps people think far more about the waste that's generated in the city as well. We've got buses that are biogas buses, which for some reason the Bristol ones are powered by food waste from Croydon. But again, it's really got huge potential, that sort of circular economy type thing as well. And I think energy is a very difficult subject to talk about without getting incredibly techy. And our colleague Alan Whitehead is the only one that understands it at that sort of level, I think, in Parliament. But I think if you talk to people in those terms, then you really can inspire them as to what the future potential is.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's really important to get the community on board in these sorts of issues. And we have a really great local community energy company in Sheffield who do projects in Sheffield Renewables. It's a cooperative, and it works really, really well. But they don't have the funding to do as many projects as they want to, and that's a real problem. So I think it's also about how we can unlock that potential. And I know that some local councils, for example, have done like their own kind of bonds and green bonds, and are looking towards like offering bonds so that wealthier residents might be able to, in a way, put finance in to the local authority to be able to help the least wealthy to green up their properties, and that kind of like community approach I think is really, really important, because if we are going to take everyone with us, this has to be affordable for those who are the least likely to be able to afford to make the transition. And we need to make sure that we're working with all parts of our communities, and not just focusing on one area. And if we talk about transport, for example, it's very easy to get fixated on electric vehicles, but actually we need to be talking about public transport, because actually the poorest in our society don't own cars, and I think that's a fact that sometimes gets forgotten in these conversations. And actually we have a really, really difficult and I know Kerry has a lot of experience thinking about these issues in her former role, but we have a lot of challenges to think about how we can make our offer at the next election much more focused on communities who are so reliant on things like good quality buses that are green and are able to help the broader community. I'll stop there. Sorry, you got me started on transport.
Thanks very much, Olivia. I think we're going to move on to the next question. Going to go second row in the pink.
Thank you so much, everyone. Following on from the last question, I'd say that it's really encouraging to hear Labour prepared to spend serious money with and meet these ambitious targets. However, as the gentleman in the front pointed out, there seems to be a bit of an elephant in the room on the supply side of oil and gas at the moment. My questions are, is Labour prepared to redirect fossil fuel subsidies, taxpayers' money, millions and millions of which are currently being spent propping up fossil fuel companies? And secondly, would a Labour government maybe be prepared to go further in climate leadership by joining the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance? Thank you.
I'm just happy to say yes. I mean, I don't know about the last aspect of your question because I'm not as familiar with that alliance, but I think you have to be like totally unequivocal about like capital and finance that currently exists in fossil fuel companies has to be divested. Like I worked on the fossil fuel divestment campaign since maybe 2016, and I'd say like from then to now, it's mainstream now. I think that that. But even back then, we were really having to push and fight and say, actually, if you want to argue it on a local level, because that's where most of the investments come from, millions of pounds locally in local government pension funds are invested in fossil fuel companies. It's an issue actually about people on the pension committee have to meet a fiduciary duty. They have to ensure that they're getting the returns of the people who have their money invested, the pensions that are looking after. And that's totally important and appropriate, right? Because these are hardworking people in local government, often cleaners, often people who spent years doing public service, who want to make sure they have a pension at the end of it. So it's appropriate that they get a return. But like, climate change is real. We can go past the point of denial, which we had at one point in the last 10 years. And we can say that actually we are going to see serious reconfigurations, serious reinvestments, serious divestments away from fossil fuel companies. So money invested in fossil fuel companies is actually financially risky. Mark Carney, the previous governor of the Bank of England, said it himself. He said these will become stranded assets. It's actually financially important and financially safe to fossil fuel divestment, on top of all the ethical, moral reasons of, like we said, we need to take that moral authority of stopping climate change. So absolutely money needs to be divested away from fossil fuel companies. The government needs to also have a mirror held to them and say they are currently subsidising fossil fuel companies, and that still continues. And I think that that's abhorrent, because I think it comes back to what the gentleman at the front was saying about our moral authority becomes redundant on a global stage when we're still subsidising fossil fuel companies. Let's see that investment into public infrastructure instead. So thank you for that question.
Would anyone else like to come in on that, or I'll move on to the next question if not?
Okay, I'm just trying to unmute. I think that's a really, really, really important question. And I think, it's been really sad to see that even when the government has changed the rules in some of their overseas investment, that they, at the last moment, snuck through investment in oil in Mozambique, which is causing absolute carnage over there, to be honest, and really destabilising that region. And I think that, I think we have to always think about our place internationally with finance as well, as locally. And I think it's really important that we hold this government to account, but also make sure that actually we recognise that the commitment that the Labour Party are giving with this 28 billion, that is going to be an absolute game changer when we win the next election, which I'm certain we will, because we have to shape this conversation. And to be quite frank, the only way we can shape that is with serious hard cash, which is what we're promising. So that 28 billion a year is going to be a massive way for us to get on with this transition. And it's that kind of state level leadership of finance that I think we need to see in this space. And I hope is replicated across the EU as well.
I'd just say very quickly, Labour has, of course, in the last week or so, proposed a windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas to help reduce energy bills. So obviously we want to move away completely from supporting the fossil fuel industry, and Matt Pennycook ahead of COP called on the government to end all overseas all support for overseas development. Olivia mentioned Mozambique, and there's quite a few other examples. And we've had people mention Cambo, which Labour was as opposed to the Cumbrian coal mine. There's now a new development in Wales that the Welsh Assembly is opposed to, sort of anthracite coal mine, which I've been calling on Gove to. It's up to him. He's the one that can stop it, basically, rather than the Welsh government. So we do need to show that opposition. We do need to support de-investment. But I think recognising that North Sea oil and gas have benefited hugely in recent years, and it's at the expense of consumers, is really important. And I think we'll get a lot of support for that windfall tax proposal.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and completely agree. And I think Labour is willing to show and demonstrate that strong climate leadership, but we're just not getting elsewhere. Next question, I'm going to go to Zach at the back.
Thank you very much. I've got a pretty quick and simple one. What is the panel's opinion on how we're going to answer the baseload question when it comes to the energy mix? I know that Labour's kind of toyed around with this idea for a little while, but I wanted to kind of get your personal opinions of what power source is going to be sufficient to answer this question. Thank you.
I think this is where we think, where's Alan Whitehead when we need him? Really, because I'm afraid I'm not an expert on energy policy, and I confess that I don't know the answer. to that.
Yeah, I'd say Alan is definitely your man for energy policy, and I've been working with Alan since being appointed in December, and I know that he's doing a lot of work on this, and I think it's really key that we answer some of these questions and soon. But I know that there's a huge amount going on around our policies on energy, and I'm sorry that I can't really answer in any more detail than that. But I think that you make a really, really good point. We do need to answer that question, and I'm confident that we will in the run up to the next election.
Okay, we've got someone up front who thinks they can answer that question. Can you do it very succinctly? That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a really important question, especially with energy prices are what they are. Yeah, I mean, often people refer to the benefits of nuclear is that it is that baseload, but obviously the amount of nuclear that we currently have online is declining because of decommissioning, and there's obviously Hinkley Point C and plans for Sizewell C as well, which are all I'd include in the CCC report, which I'd encourage you to have a read in terms of what they identify. I think if you really want to find out good information on this, look into National Grid's future energy scenarios. It's a really good report. It's based on facts and information as opposed to speculation or political points of view. Essentially, if you want to recreate that baseload that we see with nuclear, then it's a question of combining renewables, which are intermittent sources of power, with energy storage on other forms of flexibility. Other forms of flexibility being interconnectors to other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. So that's part of it. But essentially, the combination of renewables with energy storage is the key to recreating that baseload and ensuring that supply meets demand. That's all it is. It's balancing that. Another element of that is demand-side response. So how we use our energy, when do we use our energy, is key to that equation as well. So that's the short answer.
Thank you very much. And that was very helpful. Thank you. And going to go now to the lady in the green jacket over there.
Thank you. It was really great to hear from everyone on the panel. My name's Rosie. I live in Newham, so it's been great to see everything Sadiq's doing on air quality and hear more about that from Sakina. But I also work in social housing, and the question I wanted to ask today is about how Labour plans in government to deliver genuinely affordable housing and have that as part of achieving net zero, and also in places where Labour is currently in power, how it wants to work with the housing sector and social housing associations to kind of achieve decarbonisation, because it's a real priority for social housing associations at the moment that we move towards net zero. And we're kind of really keen to hear how you want to work with the housing industry on that.
I'm happy to jump in if no one else wants to. I think it's a really, really key point, and I think a lot of this will come down to local authorities and the way they're working. I think it's really challenging at the moment for local authorities, and I know some are able to take the opportunity to build at the moment. But I think there's a general concern, especially about the planning legislation that the government are wanting to bring in, and how robust that will be, and in terms of green standards, but also the ability of communities to shape what's happening on the ground. And I think that's a real risk, actually, to the whole project, really, essentially, of how we make our homes better. I think, like I say, in terms of our department, we're very focused on retrofitting, because we recognise how poor the quality is of some of the homes that we have. Here in Sheffield, we had a huge retrofit programme that really it is in need of an update again, because it's still not reached every home that was of poor quality. And I think with Right to Buy, we've seen a lot of housing go into the private sector in terms of renting as well, and getting into very, very poor condition around keeping homes warm and green. I think obviously the materials that are used in housing is really, really important too, and there's real risks that if we don't address this, then it's going to continue to be a very, very carbon heavy, concrete heavy industry. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with the sector to kind of think what the priorities are and how we're going to work together on this. But I think it absolutely has to be in the hands of local authorities to decide what's going to impact on their areas. And I think there's a real risk, if we're not diligent and keeping our eyes open, that the government will tie the hands of local authorities as they try and do right by their communities. People are desperate to build homes. We're in a housing crisis, but I think we don't want poor quality homes that are small, that don't have good energy ratings, or don't actually take into consideration climate change or things like flooding as well, and resilience and climate resilience. So I think it's a really, really important question, and one that I think we could talk for many hours about, because there's so many different issues in the housing area. And I know that social housing providers are very, very keen to get building and are feeling very frustrated at the moment. Certainly the ones in my area that I've spoken to. But yeah.
Hey, may I intervene? I've just gotten a message from the organizer. Okay.
Can I just quickly comment on that? Is that all right?
Yes, but that would be like in the last intervention. Then I think we have to close in a few minutes. Yeah.
It's just because, like I sort of started off with saying, planning and regeneration is my political lead on the London Assembly. So I thought it was a really important question. I wanted one of the MPs to be able to start off on it, because you asked about what a Labour government can achieve. But I guess I just wanted to offer a London analysis, which I'll be really, really brutally honest with you. I think there needs to be a really deep reconfiguration of the relationship between developers and government, whether that's like national, local or regional. I think I can say without any hesitation that current planning laws on a national level are tipped in the favour of developers. I think the viability assessment, that is a national planning policy, means that developers are allowed to make a certain level of profit before we negotiate affordable housing. And I think that's totally unacceptable, because if you look at the scales of that kind of profit versus the affordable housing that we end up with, which by the way is more often than not actually affordable, it's totally dystopian. So I think we need desperately quite aggressive planning reform on a national level. We saw that the Tory government attempt to create some planning reforms, and they put their head above the parapet and they wanted to make it even worse. And I think they were even shot down by their own Tory MPs. So I think as a Labour movement, we need to have really clear tools about what we want from national planning policy reform, because it's incoming. And I think we need to also have a really sharp analysis of what's wrong with the housing crisis right now, because to be honest, I think it's pretty, you can ask any Londoner specifically, like, it's impossible to rent and save in this city. It's barely possible to rent and live in this city. We need rent controls, and we need better enforcement for rogue landlords. We need to see local government given back the space, the finance, the ability to borrow to build social housing. And I think the right to buy back scheme from Sadiq was fantastic, and I think we should see things go further than that. I think we shouldn't see public land from local government be sold. I think public land should stay owned by local government and be built and have social housing and affordable housing built on it. But above all, I think we desperately need a kind of reconfigure of our relationship with developers. I think Sadiq has done a lot in his tenure to define and draw really clear water between him and Boris, and say that one of his clear strategic kind of priorities was building more affordable housing, making sure that we negotiate in many aspirational cases 50%, but we also, I think, need to revisit what is actually affordable. How do we actually enable young people to also buy? How do we enable local government to build social housing? So I think right now that analysis, to have that is crucial. To make sure renters are protected is crucial. We were promised a rental reform bill from government. They've been dithering and dathering, because I think they know that we're going to make sure that there's a ban on Section 21, no fault evictions, and we're going to ask for rent controls. But I think for me, at the core of it is planning policy, and the viability assessment needs to be, in my opinion, totally dismantled, because it's currently in its current form tipped totally in favour of developers, and we do not get affordable housing appropriately or enough as a consequence.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think then I would have to close the panel, because we're already 7 minutes over time. But thanks a lot for everybody for the great discussion and for your interventions. And for those who are in the room, I guess you can continue discussion further. And for us who are not, it was great pleasure to listen to you.